Hi. Hopefully you enjoyed our series on Ephesians. Andrew and I have been chatting about what to do next um, for these kind of reflections. Hopefully you're finding them interesting. But we've decided we're going to look at Daniel, which is one of the books of the Old Testament. It's one of the writings. And we're going to look at it probably in varying different sizes of chunks. It can be quite a confusing book. I'll tell you why in a minute. And this is just an introduction to thinking about it, really. As we did with Ephesians, the first thing that I'd suggest is that you read it end to end. There's only about a dozen chapters, so it's not a huge book, but it does get very confusing and very difficult to read about halfway through. It's a game of two halves as a book. We're going to look at it in a slightly different way. If you're looking for it, by the way, just as the first thing to say, it's about that far through your Bible. If you go to the middle and turn right, then you'll find it in amongst things like Ezekiel and Hosea. So if you find any of them, you're close. And always do find you can use your contents page of your Bible as well. It is more difficult to find because it's in the middle of the Old Testament and there can be a lot in. But yeah, about that far through. The reason why we're looking at it is that partly it's good to look at an Old Testament book and see how that relates to us. It's good to look at books that we don't always look at as well, because we believe that all the Bible is useful and inspired and good for Christians to learn from. But particularly for Daniel, we're going to be thinking a little bit about what does it mean to follow God and to live as God's children in a non-Christian culture. And Daniel's quite interesting because a lot of the book happens outside of Israel, and happens in Babylon, but also it happens in a different kind of cultural context. So whereas a lot of the prophets that were in like an exile in a different country, they were still talking as if they were, belonging within this Israelite Jewish worldview, whereas Daniel happens outside of that. So we'll see that played out, but that's why it's a really useful book to look at, because in what is increasingly perhaps a non-Christian cultural setting that we have, and certainly also in a time of fear and unsettledness, and when potentially being standing up for what we believe may be a slightly costly thing to be doing, this is a good book to read. And so we're looking at this. What does it look like to follow God, to follow Jesus in a cultural setting which is not necessarily as conducive to making that easy as possible? So that's why we're looking at Daniel. It's made up of two halves, like I said. One half is narrative, and some of the most well-known stories in the Bible are in there. You've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into a fire, and you've got Daniel being thrown into a lion's den. So they're all in the first half. You can look forward to that. We're on, familiar territory there. Good Sunday school type stories. And these are stories that are within Israel's wisdom tradition, and they talk about, they're all involved with God's ordering of the world and stuff, but there's lots we can learn from them. And then we'll move on to the second half, which is mainly apocalyptic literature, and that is slightly harder for us to get our heads around. It's where a lot of revelation comes from, this sort of same apocalyptic kind of tradition. And that is, when you read it, when you do read your Daniel cover to cover, you will find that it is weird and it's difficult to understand, and that is true. Okay, so and we're not going to delve into every minutiae as we do it. We're going to do it like we're doing Ephesians. We're going to go through it bright and breezy, and not making it the last word by any stretch. But with Apocalypse, what you're really looking at is the kind of pulling apart of the curtain that separates what goes on in earth and what goes on in heaven, and finding effectively our place, our historical moment here and now in God's big history. And that's, if you like, the value of Apocalypse really is that in times that are hard, in times where we're worried, in times where we're under fire, under stress, oppressed, feeling trapped, or in times where we're not well, in times maybe we're dying, it is a really exciting type of literature because it does find our place within the grand scheme and places us in a narrative arc that we all know ends well. In Revelation, that ends well. There's heaven at the end, the New Jerusalem comes down to earth, all that kind of stuff. That's where apocalyptic literature ends. So with Daniel, the apocalyptic stuff is more about kingdoms coming and going, and you know how God is in charge, how God brings all this about. And we'll come to that when we get to it. But that's why we're looking at it. It's a useful thing to do when you're looking at reading it through. You will get confused. It is difficult, but that's what it is. It's this drawing back so that we can see where this whole sense of God's history and where we fit into it is. All right, so read Daniel, and we'll deal with Daniel 1 on the first set of reflections in a couple of days. Okay, bye.